Imagine this. You are a princess, raised on tales of chivalry and romance. You have just traveled 1,000 miles from your home to marry the most powerful king in Europe. The cathedral is a symphony of stained glass and incense. The crowd roars your new name, and a crown of gold is placed upon your head. This is the moment your life is supposed to truly begin. But then, hours later, in the privacy of the royal bedchamber, your new husband, this king you have just bound your soul to, recoils from you. His face, once handsome and regal, twists into a mask of inexplicable horror. He screams for the guards. He shouts that the marriage must be undone, that a sorceress has been brought into his bed. He has you dragged away and thrown into a cold, damp cell. For the next 20 years, this cell is your world. Your name becomes a whispered curse at court. You are the queen he refuses to acknowledge, the wife he locked away and tried to forget. Why? To this day, no one knows for sure. But the whispers at the time were terrifying. They said that when the king looked at his new bride, he saw something monstrous. This wasn't a twisted fairy tale. This was the real-life wedding night of Ingeborg of Denmark, Queen of France, and her chilling story is just one of many. A testament to a dark and terrifying truth hidden behind the gilded tapestries of European history. These were the princesses who were forced to marry strangers, only to discover they had been bound in body and soul to a monster. Our story begins in the year 1193. Europe is a chessboard of power, and King Philip II of France, known as Philip Augustus, is its most ruthless player. He is a man forged in conflict, a brilliant strategist, and utterly unforgiving. His first wife has died, and he needs a new one. But Philip doesn't want a wife for love, or even for an heir. He wants a weapon. He sets his sights on Denmark, a kingdom of old Viking bloodlines. The Danish kings, he believes, have a dormant claim to the throne of England, his greatest rival. Marrying a Danish princess would not just secure an alliance, it would give him a legal pretext to invade. The princess chosen for this political sacrifice is Ingeborg, the 18-year-old daughter of King Valdemar I of Denmark. By all accounts, Ingeborg was a jewel. She was described as very kind, young in age, but old in wisdom. She was beautiful, intelligent, and pious. Her brother, King Canute VI of Denmark, was hesitant. He didn't trust the ambitious French king, but Philip was persistent. He promised alliances, he promised power, and he demanded a dowry of 10,000 silver marks, a king's ransom. Finally, Canute agreed. Ingeborg was packed up like a precious commodity and sent on the long, arduous journey to France. She didn't speak the language, she knew no one. All she had was the promise that she would be a queen. On the 14th of August 1193, she arrived in Amiens. Philip, seeing her for the first time, was reportedly pleased. The wedding was held the very next day with extravagant haste. In the magnificent Amiens Cathedral, Ingeborg was married to Philip, and in a separate ceremony immediately following, crowned Queen of France. For a few brief hours, she was at the pinnacle of the world. She was the wife of the most formidable monarch of his age. Then came the coronation feast, and that's when everything went wrong. Witnesses at the feast described a sudden, terrifying change in the king. In the middle of the celebration, Philip turned pale. He began to tremble, and he stared at his new bride, not with affection, but with raw, unadulterated dread. He could barely speak. He abruptly dismissed the court and cancelled the rest of the festivities. The wedding night never happened. Instead of being escorted to the royal bedchamber, Ingeborg was met by a delegation of French nobles who informed her that the king was repudiating her. He was sending her back to Denmark. Ingeborg was stunned. She had been queen for less than a day, lost and alone. Her only grasp of the local language was the 2 Latin words she had been taught for this very occasion. Over and over again she cried out, "Mala Francia, attente evil France." And as she was dragged away, she added one more word, a plea to the only power she had left, Roma. Rome. She was appealing to the Pope. But what could have caused such a violent and immediate reaction from a king as pragmatic as Philip? What did he see that turned him into a gibbering, terrified man? The court and all of Europe exploded with rumors. This is the central mystery, the hook on which Ingeborg's entire life would be snagged. Had she committed some terrible faux pas? Unlikely to provoke such a response. The French court concocted a legal excuse, claiming they were too closely related by blood, a common but flimsy pretext for royal annulments. But Philip's reaction felt personal, primal. One of the most persistent theories is that Ingeborg had a physical deformity or a medical condition that was hidden by her formal wedding attire. Some chroniclers whispered it was a skin disease. Others suggested a more intimate, skeletal malformation. The most common and enduring rumor, however, was something far more mundane, yet in the close confines of a royal marriage, potentially catastrophic, that she suffered from chronic, unbearable halitosis, or bad breath. Could a king's power be undone by something so simple? It seems trivial to us, but in a world where the royal body was seen as a reflection of the state, any perceived imperfection could be magnified into a monstrous flaw. But there was a darker, more supernatural theory. Philip himself claimed that he had been bewitched. He told his courtiers that when he went to consummate the marriage, a magic spell had rendered him impotent. He claimed that Ingeborg was a sorceress, that she had used Danish witchcraft to ensnare and unman him. This, for Philip, was the ultimate terror. For a king whose entire identity was built on power and virility, the suggestion that this foreign girl could control him, could magically rob him of his manhood, was an existential threat. And so, we must ask the question posed by the title of our story. Who was the real monster? Was it Ingeborg, with some secret flaw, or as the king claimed, some dark power? Or was the monster Philip himself, a paranoid, cruel tyrant, so obsessed with control that he would sacrifice an innocent girl's entire life based on a moment of superstitious panic? A humiliating failure in the bedroom, or a simple, sudden, inexplicable wave of revulsion? The evidence points overwhelmingly to the latter. Philip was the monster in this story, and he was about to build a cage for his unwanted queen. He tried to send her back to Denmark, but Ingeborg refused to go. She was his wife, she was the anointed queen of France, and she would not be discarded like a broken toy. Her defiance infuriated Philip. If she would not leave, he would make her disappear. He locked her away in the Abbey of Sissoing, a remote monastery. For the next 20 years, Ingeborg's life became a tour of French prisons. She was moved from convent to castle, her conditions often horrific. She was denied access to priests who spoke her language. She was given meager food, and she was kept in total isolation. She wrote a heartbreaking letter to Pope Celestine III, pleading her case. She wrote, "I am a king's daughter, the queen of a kingdom, and you see me now an afflicted woman, desiring death. In my misery, I lack the solace of hearing the Danish tongue." She was a fighter. In her lonely confinement, she learned French. She learned Latin. She studied canon law. She transformed herself from a frightened girl into a formidable legal opponent. She bombarded the papacy with letters, all arguing the same simple, unassailable point. She was Philip's lawfully wedded wife, and no king on earth had the right to set her aside. While imprisoned, Philip, believing he could do as he pleased, took another wife, a German noblewoman named Agnes of Morania. This was bigamy, a mortal sin, and a direct challenge to the authority of the Church. When a new, powerful Pope, Innocent III, was elected, Ingeborg's fortunes began to change. Innocent was a man who believed fervently in the supremacy of papal power over kings. He saw Philip's treatment of Ingeborg and his illegal second marriage as an affront to God. He championed Ingeborg's cause. He sent legates, he issued warnings. Philip ignored them all. So in the year 1200, Pope Innocent III unleashed the most devastating spiritual weapon in his arsenal. He placed the entire kingdom of France under an interdictum. Interdict was a spiritual lockdown. Churches were closed. No masses could be held. No confessions heard. No weddings or funerals consecrated. The bells of France fell silent. The dead were buried in unconsecrated ground. For the deeply religious people of medieval Europe, this was terrifying. It meant the gates of heaven were closed to them, all because of their king's stubborn cruelty. The pressure on Philip was immense. His people were on the verge of revolt. His nobles feared for their immortal souls. Finally, after 8 agonizing months, Philip relented. He publicly renounced Agnes of Morania and agreed to recognize Ingeborg as his queen. But it was a hollow victory. Agnes died shortly after, some say of a broken heart. And Philip's reconciliation with Ingeborg was a sham. As soon as the interdict was lifted, he threw her back into confinement, this time in the forbidding tower of Saint-Ampas. For another 13 years, she remained a prisoner. It was only in 1213, a full 2 decades after their disastrous wedding day, that Philip finally truly took her back. Why the change of heart? Not love, not remorse. It was pure politics. He was planning a major campaign against England, and decided, once again, that Ingeborg's old Danish claim to the English throne might be useful. The weapon he had tried to discard 20 years earlier was now being dusted off and returned to the armory. Ingeborg of Denmark lived for another 23 years. She was the official queen of France, given palaces and an income. But she was never truly Philip's wife. She lived a separate life, dedicated to prayer and charity. She outlived the king who had so monstrously wronged her. But her youth, her life, her chance at happiness had been stolen by the whim of a paranoid man. She was a queen who ruled only a kingdom of sorrow, a bride whose marriage was a 20-year sentence in a prison built of fear and pride. Her story is a stark reminder that the monster a princess might marry wasn't always a creature of legend, but often a man of immense power, for whom a wife was not a partner, but a possession. And if that possession was found to be flawed, it could be locked away in the dark and forgotten. Sometimes, however, the monster wasn't ugly or cruel on the outside. Sometimes he was beautiful, so beautiful in fact, that he was known to all the world as Philip the Handsome. And for the Spanish princess who fell obsessively in love with him, his beauty would become the most monstrous thing of all, a shining lure that would drag her down into a personal hell from which she would never escape. Her name was Juana of Castile, but history would remember her by a much crueler title. Juana Loca Juana, the Mad. Born in 1479, Juana was the daughter of 2 of the most powerful and famous monarchs in history, Isabella I of Castile and Ferdinand II of Aragon, the Catholic monarchs who unified Spain, funded Christopher Columbus, and completed the Reconquista. Juana was not raised to be a ruler. She had an older brother and an older sister. She was a spare, but a highly valuable one. She was exceptionally intelligent, a gifted musician and dancer, fluent in multiple languages. But she was also described as having a deeply passionate, melancholic and intensely religious personality. She felt everything with a terrifying ferocity. This intensity would be the key to both her great love and her great tragedy. As part of her parents' grand strategy of encircling their rival France with alliances, a marriage was arranged for 16-year-old Juana. Her husband, too, was Philip, the Duke of Burgundy, heir to the vast territories of the Low Countries and the Holy Roman Empire. He was 18 years old, and by all accounts breathtakingly handsome. He was tall, athletic, and blonde, the very image of a fairy tale prince. In 1496, Juana sailed to Flanders to meet him. Their first meeting was electric. It was not a polite, political greeting. It was a chemical explosion. Upon seeing each other, they were so instantly and powerfully attracted that they demanded a priest be found immediately. They couldn't wait for the planned, formal wedding. They were married that very same day. The passion between them was legendary. They were insatiable, locking themselves away for days, neglecting all matters of state for the pleasures of the marriage bed. Juana, with her intense and focused personality, had found the one object for all her devotion. She was completely, utterly, and obsessively in love with her beautiful husband. For a short time it was a dream, but the dream quickly curdled into a nightmare. Philip, while a passionate husband behind closed doors, was also a product of the notoriously libertine Burgundian court. He was arrogant, pleasure-seeking, and a serial philanderer. He saw no reason why marriage should stop him from enjoying the company of other women. For Juana, whose entire world now revolved around Philip, his infidelity was not just a betrayal, it was a soul-shattering cataclysm. Her intense love soured into an equally intense jealousy. And this is where the whispers began. Juana would fly into rages. She would scream at Philip. She would hunt down his mistresses. And in one famous incident, she found one of his lovers and allegedly attacked her, cutting off her beautiful blonde hair with a pair of scissors. She would burst into tears in public. She would refuse to eat. She would spend her days in a state of agitated misery, watching Philip's every move. Was this madness, or was it the understandable, if extreme, reaction of a proud, passionate woman being publicly and repeatedly humiliated by the man she adored? The monster Juana had married was not a physically repulsive creature like the one Philip of France imagined in Ingeborg. This monster was far more insidious. It was the beautiful, charming man who used her devotion as a tool and her emotional reactions as proof of her instability. Philip and his Flemish courtiers had no respect for this intense, dark-haired Spanish princess. They began to control the narrative. Her rages were not righteous anger, they were fits of insanity. Her jealousy was not a symptom of his infidelity, it was a sign of her unhinged mind. They gave her the name that would defame her for centuries: La Loca. Then, a series of tragedies changed everything. Juana's only brother, her older sister, and her sister's young son, all died in quick succession. Suddenly, the forgotten third child, Juana, was the heir to the mighty crown of Castile. And her husband, Philip the Handsome, saw his ultimate prize within his grasp. He was no longer just the Duke of Burgundy, he was on the verge of becoming the King of Castile, one of the most powerful kingdoms in the world. There was just one problem: his mad wife, Juana, the actual queen. Upon the death of her mother, the great Queen Isabella, in 1504, Juana became Queen of Castile in her own right. She and Philip travelled to Spain to claim her inheritance. But Philip had a plan. He began to conspire against his own wife, colluding with Castilian nobles who were eager to have a pliable foreign king instead of a strong-willed queen. He actively spread rumors of her insanity, claiming she was unfit to govern. He isolated her, restricted her access to her own Spanish allies, and tried to force her to sign over her royal authority to him. He was, in effect, trying to gaslight an entire nation into believing its rightful queen was mad so he could steal her throne. The monster was revealing his true face: a power-hungry manipulator hiding behind a handsome facade. He even entered into a conspiracy with Juana's own father, Ferdinand of Aragon, who was also loath to give up power. The two men in her life who should have protected her, her husband and her father, were now plotting to have her declared legally incompetent. She was trapped. Then, in 1506, fate intervened in the most dramatic way possible. After drinking a glass of cold water after a game of pelota, the supremely athletic, 28-year-old Philip the Handsome fell violently ill. Within days, he was dead. The shock of his death pushed Juana over the edge, not into madness, but into a state of profound, macabre grief that would seal her reputation forever. This is the most famous part of her story, the part that has been painted and dramatized for centuries. Juana refused to be separated from her husband's body. She had his heart cut out so she could keep it with her. She had his body embalmed and placed in a lead casket. And then she began a journey. For 8 months, through the bleak winter of the Castilian plains, the pregnant Queen Juana traveled with her husband's funeral court Fontgi. She would travel only at night, she said, because a widow who has lost the son of her own soul should not be seen in the light of day. Periodically, she would order the procession to halt. She would have the casket opened so she could look upon the face of her dead husband, the beautiful man she both loved and hated. She would kiss his feet. She was not, as the rumors claimed, caressing him or trying to revive him. These were ritualistic acts of grief, and perhaps of ultimate possession. In death, Philip was finally, totally hers. He could not stray, he could not betray her. He was trapped in her orbit, just as she had been trapped in his. This bizarre grief-stricken procession across Spain was the final, indelible proof for her enemies. The queen was truly, irrevocably mad. Her father, Ferdinand, saw his chance. He returned to Castile, seized control, and ordered his own daughter to be confined in the royal convent of Santa Clara in the grim, remote town of Tordesillas. And there Juana, the rightful queen of Castile, would remain for the rest of her life. After her father's death, her own son, the future Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, inherited the throne and kept his mother locked away. He would visit her occasionally, but he never freed her. For 46 years, she was a queen in name only, a prisoner in a gilded cage, her existence a political inconvenience. Was Juana of Castile mad? It is a question historians still debate. She was certainly unstable, prone to extreme depression and obsessive behavior. But it is undeniable that her condition was deliberately and cruelly exacerbated by the men around her. Her husband, Philip, weaponized her emotions against her. Her father and her son chose power over her freedom. The madness of Juana was, at the very least, a fire fanned by monstrous ambition and emotional cruelty. She married a beautiful monster, and in the end, the world decided it was she who was the monstrous one. A convenient lie that allowed them to steal her crown and entomb her alive. So far we have seen princesses whose lives were destroyed by a husband's revulsion and another's ambition. But what if the monster a princess was forced to marry was not a single man, but the system itself? What if the monster was the cold, unfeeling machinery of politics that viewed a human life as nothing more than a bargaining chip? This was the fate of Isabella of Valois, a princess of France who was crowned Queen of England before she had even lost all of her baby teeth. Her story is monstrous not because of an evil husband, but because of the chilling indifference with which her childhood was sacrificed on the altar of diplomacy. We travel back to the late 14th century. England and France are locked in the bloody century. Long struggle we call the 100 Years' War. The land is exhausted, the treasuries are empty, and both kingdoms desperately need a respite. King Richard II of England and King Charles V of France agree to a truce. But to seal this fragile peace, they need more than a document. They need a marriage. Richard II was a widower, still in deep mourning for his first wife, the beloved Anne of Bohemia. He was 29 years old, a complex and increasingly autocratic king, struggling to control a court of powerful, ambitious nobles. His French counterpart, Charles V, had a daughter, Isabella. In 1396, when the treaty was finalized, Princess Isabella of Valois was 6 years old. Let that sink in. 6, a child who should be playing with dolls was about to become a key piece in a geopolitical chess game. The monster in this story is the absolute moral void of medieval statecraft. To the men negotiating this treaty, Isabella's age was not an obstacle. It was a feature. A child queen could be raised and molded in England, strengthening the bonds between the two nations. Her marriage would not be consummated for years, giving the truce time to solidify. Her innocence was not something to be protected, but something to be exploited. Richard II travelled to Calais to meet his future bride. The chronicles describe a surreal scene. The powerful King of England, a grown man, formally greeting this little girl. He reportedly spoke to her gently, trying to put her at ease. He was said to be delighted by her precocious and dignified responses. He presented her with gifts, and she was formally handed over to the English delegation. She was leaving her home, her family, her language, and her entire world behind. At 6 years old, she was now an English queen. The wedding took place in Calais, a lavish affair that highlighted the absurdity of the situation. Isabella, dressed in a miniature gown of royal blue velvet, embroidered with golden fleurs, stood beside the tall English king. She dutifully recited the vows that had been taught to her, her child's voice piping up in the cavernous church. She was then taken to England and installed in her own household at Windsor Castle. By all accounts, Richard treated her with kindness and fatherly affection. He visited her often, brought her presents, and wrote to her father that he was charmed by her. He seemed to genuinely care for her well-being. So, if Richard was not a personal monster, where does the horror lie? It lies in the sheer wrongness of the situation. It lies in a system that looked at a 6-year-old girl and saw not a child, but a political asset. Isabella was a queen, but she was also a prisoner of her own status. She was surrounded by English ladies, in waiting, forced to learn a new language and new customs. She was a symbol of a peace that her very existence was supposed to guarantee. But the peace was a fragile fantasy. Back in England, Richard's reign was crumbling. His lavish spending, his reliance on a small circle of favourites, and his increasingly tyrannical behaviour had alienated the powerful nobles of the realm. Chief among his enemies was his own cousin, Henry Bolingbroke, the Duke of Hereford, whom Richard had exiled. In 1399, while Richard was away on a campaign in Ireland, Henry Bolingbroke returned to England, not just to claim his inheritance, but to claim the throne itself. Support for Richard collapsed with shocking speed. When he returned from Ireland, he was ambushed, captured, and forced to abdicate. Henry Bolingbroke was crowned King Henry Eve. Suddenly, the world of the young Queen Isabella was shattered. She was now just 10 years old. Her kind, if unconventional, husband was a deposed enemy of the state. She was moved from her comfortable residence at Windsor to the dreary palace of Sunning, effectively under house arrest. She was the widow of a deposed king, a French princess in a country now ruled by her husband's enemy. She was a political problem. What was the new king, Henry Eve, to do with her? Richard I's fate was grim. He was imprisoned in the remote and formidable Pontefract castle. Within months he was dead, almost certainly murdered on Henry Ivor's orders, likely by starvation. The news was kept from Isabella, but she eventually learned the truth. The 10-year-old girl was now a widow. Henry Ivor's solution to the Isabella problem was simple. He proposed to marry her to his own son and heir, the future King Henry V, the famous Prince Hal. From a political standpoint, it made perfect sense. It would maintain the French connection and legitimize the new Lancastrian dynasty. But Isabella, a child of only 10, showed a strength of character that stunned the English court. She flatly refused. She went into deep, formal mourning for her dead husband, Richard, defying the new king and his entire regime. She refused to acknowledge Henry IV as king and rejected any and all proposals to marry his son. She was a lone child, a pawn on the board, but she refused to be moved. Her defiance created a diplomatic standoff. For 2 years, she remained in England, a reluctant guest, a constant reminder of the deposed king. Finally, Henry IV, realizing she would never bend to his will, and under pressure from the French court, agreed to let her return home. But he did so begrudgingly, even refusing to return her substantial dowry and jewels. In 1401, Isabella of Valois, the girl who had been Queen of England, returned to France. She was not yet 12 years old. Her brief, strange marriage was over. Her childhood had been stolen, spent as a political symbol in a foreign land. The trauma defined her. She eventually married again, to her cousin Charles, Duke of Orleans. This marriage seemed to be a happy one, but her story ends in tragedy. In 1409, at the age of just 21, Isabella died after giving birth to her only child. Her life, which had begun with such grand political purpose, was cut short. She was a sacrifice to a peace that never lasted. A child queen whose reign was a brief, surreal interlude in a bloody war. The monster she married was the cold, calculating heart of politics itself, a beast that consumes the innocent without a second thought. So we have a queen caged for a king's mysterious revulsion, a queen driven to madness by a beautiful devil, and a child queen sacrificed for a failed peace. Different circumstances, different eras, but they all faced the same horrifying reality. They were forced to look into the eyes of a stranger and call him husband. And in that moment, they had to wonder, have I just married a monster? The monster wasn't always a man. Sometimes it was the crown itself. The very system that made them princesses was the same system that could feed them to the wolves. For our final story, we meet a princess who fought this system her entire life, only to be consumed by it in the end. Her monster was not one man, but two, and the prize they sought was not her love, but her very homeland. This is the story of Anne of Brittany, the duchess who was forced to marry her conqueror. At the end of the 15th century, the Duchy of Brittany was like a Celtic stone, stubbornly resisting the tide of French expansion. It had its own language, its own laws, and a fierce sense of independence. And its ruler from the age of 11 was a young woman named Anne. Anne of Brittany was no passive princess. She was intelligent, proud, and fiercely dedicated to preserving her duchy's autonomy. From the moment she inherited the title, her life was a desperate political and military struggle against the ambitions of the powerful Kingdom of France. France under the regency of another formidable Anne de Beaujeu, the elder sister of the young King Charles VIII, saw an independent Brittany as a threat on its western flank. They wanted it absorbed into the kingdom. The conflict, known as the Mad War, culminated in a French invasion. Anne of Brittany, still a teenager, led the resistance. She was a warrior duchess, a symbol of Breton identity, but her small duchy was no match for the might of the French army. In 1491 she was cornered, besieged in her last stronghold, the city of Rennes. Her people were starving. Her army was broken. She was defeated. France offered her terms, or rather, they offered her a choice between two forms of destruction. She could see her duchy completely annexed and erased from the map, or she could secure a measure of autonomy for it by doing the unthinkable, marrying the man who had just conquered her. Her enemy, her vanquisher, King Charles VIII of France. For Anne, a woman who had defined her entire existence in opposition to France, this was a monstrous choice. Charles VIII was not just her political foe, he was the physical embodiment of her nation's defeat. To make matters worse, contemporary accounts describe Charles as physically unimpressive. He was short, with a large, disproportionate head, pale, vacant eyes, and an awkward, stumbling gait. This was the man she was now forced to marry to save her people. To add to the humiliation, Anne was already married by proxy to Maximilian I of Austria, a political alliance she had made to try and fend off the French. The French army simply annulled this prior commitment by force. She had no choice. In the Château de Langis, with French soldiers standing guard, the 14-year-old Anne of Brittany was married to the 21-year-old King Charles VIII. Her marriage bed was the grave of her nation's freedom. The marriage contract was a masterpiece of political cruelty. It stipulated that Anne would cede the rights to her duchy to her husband, but the most monstrous clause was yet to come. It stated that if Charles VIII were to die without a son, Anne was legally bound to marry his successor. She was not a person. She was a piece of property, a human clause in a treaty designed to ensure that, one way or another, Brittany would belong to France. Her body, her future, her very womb, was now an asset of the French crown. Her marriage to Charles was not a happy one. They lived largely separate lives. She bore him several children, but none survived infancy. For 7 years, she was the reluctant Queen of France, a Breton hawk in a gilded French cage. Then, in 1498, the improbable happened. Charles VIII, still a young man, died in a freak accident. While on his way to watch a tennis match, he struck his head with violent force on the stone lintel of a low doorway. He collapsed and died a few hours later. Suddenly Anne was free. She was a 21-year-old widow. The monster was dead. She acted with lightning speed. She immediately left the French court, returned to Brittany, and took up the reins of power once more. She established her own chancellery, minted coins with her own image, and began to rule as the independent Duchess of Brittany she had always been. For a brief, glorious moment, it seemed she had won. She had outlasted her conqueror, but the monster she faced was not just one man. It was the insatiable ambition of the French monarchy. And the treaty she had been forced to sign was a trap, waiting to spring shut. The new King of France was Charles's cousin, who became King Louis C. And according to that monstrous marriage contract, Anne was now obligated to marry him. Louis C. was a middle-aged man who was already married. He had been wed for 22 years to Joan of France, the pious and disabled daughter of a previous king. But that was a mere inconvenience. The prize of Brittany was too great. Louis C. immediately petitioned the Pope for an annulment of his long-standing marriage, using the cruel and false pretext that the marriage had never been consummated due to his wife's physical deformities. The Pope, eager for a political alliance with France, granted it. Joan of France was cast aside and sent to a convent. Another tragic princess sacrificed for power. Anne was trapped. She had no army, no allies powerful enough to defy the French king. The jaws of the treaty were closing around her. The second monster had come to claim his prize. To her credit, she negotiated from a position of weakness, with incredible skill. She knew she had to marry Louis, but she crafted a new marriage contract that was far more favorable to Brittany. It stated that Brittany would remain a separate administrative entity from France, and that their second son, or a daughter if they had no sons, would inherit the duchy, thus keeping it separate from the French crown. It was a brilliant legal maneuver, an attempt to preserve her homeland's future even as she sacrificed her own. Her marriage to Louis C. was, surprisingly, much more successful than her first. They seemed to develop a genuine respect and affection for one another. But it was a relationship forever shadowed by the political reality that had forced them together. Anne dedicated herself to her role, but never stopped being the Duchess of Brittany first, and the Queen of France second. She fought fiercely to protect Breton rights at the French court, yet her personal tragedy and her political tragedy were intertwined. She gave Louis 2 daughters, but no sons. According to her hard-won contract, her eldest daughter, Claude, should have inherited the Duchy of Brittany. But after Anne's death in 1514, Louis VI, and later his successor, King Francis I, broke the spirit of the agreement. They married Claude to Francis, ensuring that the future King of France would also be the Duke of Brittany. In 1532, years after Anne's death, the Duchy of Brittany was formally and permanently incorporated into the Kingdom of France. Anne of Brittany fought her entire life. She fought with armies, with treaties, and with sheer force of will. She married 2 consecutive kings of the nation that was her sworn enemy. She submitted her body to save her homeland, only to become the very instrument of its final absorption. The monster she married wasn't just Charles or Louis. It was the relentless, grinding force of history, a force that ultimately wears down even the strongest stone. Her life was a heroic, tragic testament to a princess who refused to be a pawn, yet was checkmated by destiny in the end. Caged, driven mad, widowed as a child, conquered and claimed as a prize. The stories of Ingeborg, Juana, Isabella, and Anne are separated by centuries and circumstances, yet they are bound by a common terrifying thread. They were born to the highest peaks of society, but this privilege came at an unbearable price. They were not seen as women, but as wombs. Not as people, but as political pawns. Their happiness, their autonomy, their very lives were disposable commodities in the great bloody Game of Thrones. We remember the names of the kings, the dates of the battles, the lines drawn on the maps. But behind those cold, hard facts are the frantic heartbeats of these young women, sent into the dark to face an unknown fate. They were told it was their duty. They were told it was for the good of the kingdom. But as they stood at the altar, looking at the strange, powerful man who would now own them, body, title and soul, they must have all, at some point, had the same terrifying thought that echoes down the corridors of history. I am marrying a monster. And the greatest, most enduring horror of all, sometimes they were absolutely right.